Well guys, it's summer sale time, and that means we're back with another tier list. We'll be sticking to the same format as last time, with 3 different ratings for each vehicle, 1 for noobs, 1 for average players, and 1 for veterans. We'll be doing air first, then ground. Let's get straight into it. First off for air, we have the FA-18 Hornet. The Hornet is not by any means a bad aircraft. The problem with this vehicle really just comes down to the matchmaker. Against 13.0 and 13.3 premiums, which are slinging Fox 3s, your Sparrows are just not going to be competitive, and your short-range AIM-9Ls won't be very effective at this BR either. Your one competitive feature really is your excellent maneuverability, assuming you can somehow survive the hail of incoming radar missiles to actually get to within dogfighting range. For players who have some idea of what they're doing, this is not a bad option, but you're going to be a below average vehicle in most of the matches you find yourself in, and for that reason, D for noobs, C tier for average players and veterans. Next we have the A-10. So the biggest upside of this vehicle I would point to is the fact that this gives you an aircraft you can use in both air and ground RB. The problem is, though, you're not fantastic at either. In both cases, you're going to be thrown into scenarios this thing really was not designed for, that being fighting in airspace which is heavily contested by both enemy aircraft and air defense systems. Again, it's not bad, but it's not really very strong either. I'm just going to put this in C tier across the board. And now finally, the one some of you have been waiting for months for, the Su-30 Mk2. I know many of you, especially Hornet pilots, probably hate this thing with a burning passion and would probably consider it to be outright overpowered, but there's a very important caveat you need to know about this thing if you're considering purchasing it. While this thing will definitely beat up on enemies it faces in a down tier, it suffers just as heavily as those aircraft do when faced with an up tier. This is because, for one, its radar is locked into a very wide search angle, which makes it difficult to acquire targets quickly, and its Fox 3s have very short range. For people who know what they're doing, this is a solid option, but for noobs who might not have a good understanding of radars, notching, and Fox 3s, you are not going to want to purchase this thing. For these reasons, D tier for noobs, B tier for average players and veterans. Next we have the Chinese Su-30. Pretty much everything I said about the Mk2 applies to this aircraft as well. The only big difference is the fact that it gets access to PL-12s, which were recently nerfed, but this still gives it a bit of a leg up at medium range, as well as PL-8Bs, which I would consider superior to the R-73 due to its better acceleration. Even so, same rating here, D tier for noobs, B tier for average players and veterans. Next we have the Swiss Hornet. Everything I said about the American one applies to this one too, though be aware this one does actually have stronger engines than the other Hornets on this list, so if you're determined to buy one and don't care which tech tree it's in, buy this one. Again, D tier for noobs, C tier for average players and veterans. Next up is the Viper Zero. If you are very experienced at high tier air RB, this is the best option available to you on this list, full stop. This is a bit of a difficult aircraft to get the hang of, but once you do, it is unbelievably good. The main thing that's tricky about this aircraft is the BVR armament. At 13.0, Sparrows are pretty lackluster, but other than that one deficiency and the fact that it's a little bit on the slower side, everything else about it is absolutely amazing. For one thing, its flight model is absolutely cracked. If you have an upgraded crew, you can sustain 14 Gs in a high-speed turn, and it will beat basically anything it encounters in a sustained dogfight, though do be aware the Hornet can outrate you. It also gets access to the AAM-3, which I would consider the best short-range IR missile in the game thanks to its insane range. For these reasons, for noobs, C tier, for average players, B tier, for veterans, S tier. Next we have the British Hornet. This one is pretty much a copy-paste of the American one, and yet again, D tier for noobs, C tier for average players and veterans. Next we have the MiG-23. I'll just say right off the bat that if you're a newer player, this is a very good option for you. At this battle rating, you'll encounter a much more forgiving matchmaker, and your R-24 radar missiles are outstanding at close range. This makes the MiG-23 a relatively brain-dead easy aircraft to fly as long as you're using the right strategy, making this a very solid choice for noobs especially, and for that reason, A tier for noobs, B tier for average players and veterans. Next we have the Viggen. This is a very obsolete airframe for the BR with a very good missile armament. The AMRAAMs are probably the best missile available to any pack premium aircraft around this battle rating, and if you get the hang of using them, this aircraft will be the single most brain-dead easy vehicle to grind with on this list. The problem is, it's still stuck with AIM-9Ls, and its airframe is not at all good for the battle rating. For that reason, more experienced players will probably feel quite held back by this aircraft, so A tier for noobs, B tier for average players, C tier for veterans. Next we have the F-5C. I'll say up front, if you're a new player, this is not the aircraft for you. The F-5C requires a very strong grasp of energy conservation in order to do well in it, especially because you can't really count on the missiles to be getting you a lot of kills. If you are pretty experienced though, I find this to be a very fun and rewarding aircraft to fly thanks to its excellent energy retention. D tier for noobs, B tier for average players, A tier for veterans. Next we have the Comanche. The only people I would really recommend this to are people who like to mess around with helicopters, but otherwise Hellfire missiles are really just not meta and it's not worth spending a bunch of money on. D tier across the board. Next we have a helicopter which is actually pretty strong, the Ka-50. The reason it's so strong is, one, because it has a 30mm autocannon with APDS rounds, which basically means this thing is a flying BMP-2. It also has Vickers missiles, which have high enough velocity to actually compete with enemy SPAA. There's a reason a lot of people have considered this thing to be outright overpowered, B tier for noobs, A tier for average players and veterans. Next up is the MiG-29 Sniper. So the problem with this aircraft really comes down to armament. This vehicle carries R-27ERs, which are excellent missiles for the battle rating. The problem is you only get 2 of them, and after that you're stuck with R-60Ms, which are just hopelessly obsolete. You also don't have a super dominant airframe for dogfighting either. Due to this lack of staying power, I would just not recommend this vehicle, D tier across the board. Next we have the NF-5C. This is basically a straight up upgrade over the F-5C with better engines and better missiles. Still not super beginner friendly, but a very strong option for anyone who knows what they're doing. C tier for noobs, A tier for average players, S tier for veterans. Next we have the Tornado IDS. This is basically just a dedicated base bombing vehicle, which in fairness can be a reliable grinding method, but I would never recommend anyone do it that way because 1, it isn't fun, and 2, you don't learn anything by doing it. C tier for noobs, D tier for average players and veterans. Next we have the Su-39. I'm a massive contrarian when it comes to this aircraft. I know a lot of people say it sucks, but I would tell you that they're just playing it wrong. The Vickers and KH-25s can actually be used relatively effectively against aircraft, plus you have R-73s, and on top of that, this thing will actually beat a MiG-21 if you can sucker them into a vertical loop. I was using this thing to grind part of the recent air event, and while streaming to my Discord, I got multiple 6-kill games in air RB. On top of that, it's very good in ground RB too. The only downside of this aircraft is the fact that flying it and using all of the keybinds is kind of difficult, so I would definitely not recommend this to newer players. For these reasons, D tier for noobs, A tier for average players, S tier for veterans. Next is the Tiger HAD. I will say one redeeming quality worth mentioning about this vehicle is the fact that it gets pretty good air-to-air missiles, which makes it actually decent as a flying SPAA essentially. Unless you're a hardcore German main wanting to pad your lineup though, would not recommend this one. D tier for noobs, C tier for everyone else. And wrapping it all up, we have the JH-7. This one is a bit difficult to rate because it kind of depends on what you're looking for. This is a decent cast platform, and an ARB can actually do pretty decently sometimes thanks to its good IR missiles, though it's not super outstanding at either role. If you're looking to play China and want something to play in both ground and air RB, this is a very good option in my opinion, but this is not by any means a brain-dead easy or noob-friendly vehicle. D tier for noobs, B tier for average players and veterans. And for those of you who want to see them, I'll leave the finished tier lists up on the screen for a sec. Starting off ground forces, we have the French Leopard 2A4. The Leopard 2A4 is an extremely well-rounded main battle tank which is survivable, has decent firepower, and great mobility. It's not invincible by any means though, and will struggle to frontally penetrate other main battle tanks around the BR if you're not aiming for weak spots. That being said, for experienced players with better map knowledge, this is a very strong option. C tier for noobs, B tier for average players, A tier for veterans. Now we have the single most overpowered vehicle in the entire game currently, the Terminator. The reason it's so OP is because at the moment, detonating its internal ammo does not destroy the vehicle. This means you have to actually kill the crew in order to destroy the vehicle, and that's assuming you can even reach them, since it can just poke its unmanned turret out from behind cover, and they're also protected by spall liners, which makes it very difficult to kill in one hit too. S tier across the board, obviously this is just a straight up overpowered vehicle. And speaking of OP, next we have the T-58. This is a heavy tank based on the M103 chassis, which gets access to a 155mm cannon with a 2.6 second reload. Combined with its heavy armor, this makes the T-58 incredibly powerful for brawling. Still though, this vehicle is not quite as brain-dead OP as the Terminator, since at its BR, it can often face dart rounds and laser rangefinders, which will melt clean through its armor, so you do need to actually play smart with this one. For these reasons, A tier for noobs, S tier for average players and veterans. Next we have the Clickbait. So I know a lot of American mains are rather pissed off at Gaijin for how weak the Abrams hull armor is in-game currently, but even with that, this is still a very mobile vehicle with over 600mm of pen on its main gun and a 5-second ace reload. Like the Leopard 2A4, if you know what you're doing, this can be an incredibly effective flanking vehicle, but it definitely is not super noob friendly. C tier for noobs, B tier for average players, and A tier for veterans. Next we have the RDF-LT. This is a very weird vehicle as it's a light tank, but its mobility is actually worse than many MBTs, but it gets scouting, a 75mm autocannon, and proxy fuse rounds you can use against aircraft. Situationally, it can be very strong, and this is actually the highest BR vehicle I've ever gotten a nuke with, at least as far as I can recall. C tier for noobs, B tier for average players, A tier for veterans. So unlike the Western MBTs, the T-80 is actually very survivable and well armored, making it much more forgiving for newer players. It also recently had its reload buff to only 6 seconds. The downsides of this vehicle though are that it has pretty bad gun depression, a bad reverse gear, and its dart round isn't quite as strong as the American and German premiums that this BR have, so experienced players may feel a bit held back by it. I'm actually going to rank this B tier for noobs, A tier for average players, and B tier for veterans. Next up is the Term 3. This is basically a specialized flanking vehicle with incredible mobility and excellent firepower, but basically no armor protection to speak of. It did recently get its BR raised, and the lack of armor makes it not very forgiving for newer players, but still a very good vehicle overall. C tier for noobs, B tier for average players, A tier for veterans. For some reason, it seems that all Japanese premiums have this characteristic where they're very unforgiving to new players, but have a very high skill ceiling, and the Fuji really encapsulates this. Compared to the other high-tier premium MBTs around this BR, it has pretty weak frontal armor and a very weak dart round for the battle rating, but it has incredible mobility and a 4-second autoloader, which means if you can pull off a successful flank, you can do a lot of damage very quickly. This is not a vehicle I would recommend to anyone who isn't experienced at playing high-tier ground though, so D tier for noobs, B tier for average players, but S tier for veterans. Next we have the Ariete. This is your classic glass cannon sort of vehicle. It has a very good gun and a fast reload, but has basically no effective armor protection against main gun rounds, and extremely poor overall survivability due to keeping all of its ammunition in the hull. It also has surprisingly poor mobility on top of all that. Experienced players can certainly make it work, but otherwise D tier for noobs, C tier for average players, B tier for veterans. Next we have the Leopard 2A4M. This is a modernized Leopard 2A4 operated by the Canadians. This vehicle is inferior to the Clickbait in most areas, but has a bit of a leg up situationally since it gets better thermals and also gets to fight the Americans, giving it a bit of a better matchmaker. It's also kind of a glass cannon, though not nearly to the same extent as the Ariete, which means it's not going to be forgiving for newer players. So overall, I would put this in D tier for noobs, B tier for average players, A tier for veterans. Next we have the Merkava. This is a vehicle with a very good gun, but a lot of problems otherwise. Its armor is trolly, but otherwise ineffective against dart rounds, and also it's not very mobile and has below average gun depression. I'd say the trolly armor and good firepower make it a decently forgiving option for newer players, but experienced ones may feel held back by these deficiencies. So for these reasons, B tier for noobs, C tier for average players and veterans. Next we have the Christian 2. This is mostly identical to the other premium Leopard 2, except with different smoke grenade launchers and losing out on the heat shell in return for an HE shell, which doesn't really matter to be honest. The same positive things I have to say about the French Leo 2A4 hold true here, though it's probably worth mentioning that this also has an incredibly strong lineup to run alongside it, with a bunch of other Leopard 2 and CB90 variants at 10.3 and 10.7, plus the Strike Viggen. C tier for noobs, B tier for average players, A tier for veterans. Next up is the German Leopard 2. The same glazing I gave the others applies here. C tier for noobs, B tier for average players, A tier for veterans. Next up is the Type 61. The upside of this vehicle is that it gets a very high velocity heat shell at a very low battle rating, but the downsides are that it has absolutely terrible survivability and not fantastic mobility either. Definitely not beginner friendly, and while more experienced players can still make do with it, I'm sure, I would still recommend the Fuji. C tier for noobs and average players, B tier for veterans. Next up we have the Al-Khalid. This thing used to be unbelievably overpowered before getting its BR raised, and even now it's still no slouch in a full up tier 12.7, but I would rank this as more of a decent to good vehicle rather than an overpowered one these days. Its frontal armor is not fantastic, but it can be pretty trolly. Its firepower is good, and it's quite mobile. Anyone who has experience with high tier ground RB will have no problem holding their own in this thing. C tier for noobs, B tier for average players and veterans. Next up is the Challenger DS. This vehicle shares many of the same problems as the aforementioned Ariete, with poor hull armor, ammo stored in the hull, and on top of that, pretty weak mobility. On the bright side though, this vehicle gets decent turret protection, so it's quite strong fighting hull down. Because it can be strong situationally, I'll be a bit generous with my rating here and give it a C tier for noobs, B tier for average players and veterans. Next up we have the BMD-4M. As I often mention when covering this vehicle, there's a reason nuke speedrunners love this thing. It's incredibly mobile, has outstanding firepower, though obviously it's a complete glass cannon. If you have solid map knowledge, you'll be able to absolutely mop up in this thing. B tier for noobs, A tier for average players, S tier for veterans. Next up is the T55 AM1. I would say if you're a noob who wants to experience that sort of high tier main battle tank type of gameplay, this right here is your vehicle. Despite sitting at 9.0, this thing gets all the fancy bells and whistles of top tier vehicles like composite armor, a dart round, a laser rangefinder, etc. It's still a T55 though, so it's certainly no overpowered super tank or anything, but it's a relatively well balanced and forgiving vehicle. A tier for noobs, A tier for average players, and B tier for veterans. Next up is the Type 16. I really want to like this thing because it has an Evangelion skin. The problem with wheeled vehicles in general though is the fact that they can't traverse in place like tanks can, which is a serious problem on urban maps, which you see a lot of in this game. Also, this vehicle in particular has very weak protection and survivability, and your 6 degrees of gun depression makes it difficult to hold down snipe either. D tier across the board, just buy the Fuji. Next we have the Hungarian PZH 2000. This is a very funny vehicle because thanks to having a high velocity proximity fuse shell, this actually works very well as an SPAA while also maintaining a pretty potent anti-armor capability thanks to its laser rangefinder. If you're an Italian main, I would highly recommend this one, though it's difficult to rate objectively, so I'm just going to stick it at B tier across the board. And wrapping it all up, we have the Type 74 Red Star. The main point in favor of this vehicle is the fact that it gets a laser rangefinder at a relatively low BR, and thanks to its heavily angled cast turret, it's relatively well protected when fighting hull down compared to a lot of other Western MBTs around this BR. The problem is it's not super well armored otherwise, and its mobility is actually surprisingly not that amazing. Experienced players can do okay with it, but newer ones are likely going to struggle. D tier for noobs, C tier for average players, B tier for veterans. Again, I would recommend just buying the Fuji instead. And for those of you who want to see them, here are the finished tier lists. Thank you guys again for watching. I hope you found this helpful, and I'll see you guys again very shortly with some update related content.